Hey, my name is Sam Rourke. I'm 33 years old, and for most of my life I didn't have what you'd call an address. I had a truck and a canvas duffel and a set of tools that could fix about anything with a working part left in it, and I moved the way water moves, downhill and away, taking seasonal work wherever the work was. Apple harvests in one valley, roofing in another, a winter mending fence in a place so cold the nail gun froze. I told people I liked the freedom of it, and that was half true. The other half, the half I didn't say, was that a man who never stays never has to find out whether anybody wanted him to. You can't be left if you leave first. I'd worked that math out young, and I'd lived by it so long I'd stopped noticing it was a wound and not a philosophy. My duffel stayed half-packed on principle. I knew where the door was in every room I ever slept in. And then I drove into a valley in the last week of a September 2 years back, looking for a few weeks of harvest money. And I turned up a gravel lane under a tunnel of old apple trees heavy with fruit, and I met a stubborn old man named Walt Ames who needed a hand and had a tenant cottage standing empty at the edge of his orchard, and I meant to stay 6 weeks. I'm still there. This is the story of how a plate of food I never asked for taught a drifter what an address is actually for. The Ames Orchard is the kind of place that shouldn't still exist. 40 acres of old-growth apple trees on a south slope, some of them 100 years old, gnarled and mossy and still bearing, planted by Walt's grandfather and grafted over by Walt's father and kept alive by Walt himself, through drought and blight and the long, slow decline of every small farm you've ever driven past and felt sad about without knowing why. Walt was near 80 when I met him, all leather and cussedness, with a bad hip and a worse heart and a refusal to admit to either. He needed help he was too proud to ask for, and I needed to not be asked, so we suited each other. I fixed his fences and his failing tractor and the sag in the barn roof, and I learned the trees from him, which ones bore early, which ones needed the deer fence, the old heirloom row he loved above all the rest, a variety his grandfather had bred right there on the hill that Walt called the Ames Sweet, an apple you cannot buy in any store on earth because it bruises if you look at it wrong and tastes, the first bite of a cold one in October, like honey and wood smoke and something you can't name that makes grown men go quiet. Walt would let me stay in the cottage for cheap in trade for the work, and the arrangement was clean and wordless and exactly the kind of temporary I was built for. Except for the daughter. Josie Ames had moved back to the orchard a few months before I turned up, to look after her father, whose heart had started skipping in ways that scared the doctors. She'd left a life in the city to do it, a good job in a restaurant kitchen and, I gathered later, a man who hadn't been worth the leaving behind, and she'd come home to a cranky old man and 40 acres of apples and a lot of silence, and into that silence, one rainy evening my first week, she walked across the wet grass from the farmhouse to my cottage with a cast-iron pot held in a dish towel, and knocked on my door. There's no sense in you eating cold beans out of a can in a dark cottage while I cook for one across the yard, she said, not quite meeting my eye, holding out the pot. It's beef and barley. Dad won't eat half of what I make. You'd be doing me a favor keeping it from going to waste. I want to tell you I said something gracious. What I actually did was stand there like a fence post, because nobody in about 15 years had cooked me a meal that wasn't slid across a diner counter, and I had genuinely forgotten what to do with the sight of a woman holding out a pot of something warm in the rain. I took it. I ate every bite. And the next night there was a knock again, and the night after that, and somewhere in the first 2 weeks it stopped being about leftovers and became the thing both of our days bent around. That was how it started. Josie Ames fixed me dinner every night, and for 2 years it was the best hour I had ever known, and I was too much of a coward and too well trained at leaving to ever once tell her so. She was a wonder in a kitchen. Her mother had taught her, and her mother's mother before that, out of a wooden recipe box on the windowsill, so old the cards had gone soft as cloth, and Josie cooked like it was a language she was translating for me. apple butter she put up in the fall, a pork roast with the orchard's own cider, hand pies with the Ames sweet that I would have committed crimes for. We ate at the little table in my cottage, or on the porch when it was warm, and we talked, or we didn't, and both were good. She told me over months the shape of her life, the restaurant she'd loved and the head chef who took credit for her menu, the man in the city who'd called her ambitions cute right up until she started to believe him. The way coming home to care for her dying father had felt at first like the final proof that her real life was over, and then, slowly, like the only real life she'd ever had. And I told her almost nothing true about myself, because that's the drifter's discipline. But she got it anyway, the way she got everything. And one night she set down her fork and said, "You keep that duffel packed." "Don't you? I've seen it through the door. 2 years and it's still half packed." And I said, "Habit." And she looked at me a long moment and said, "It's not a habit, Sam. It's a promise you made to yourself so you'd never have to be brave." And then she picked her fork back up and let it go, which is the kindest thing anyone had ever done with the truth about me. The seasons taught me the orchard, and the orchard taught me her. In spring we walked the rows together, checking the blossom set, and she showed me how to read a tree's health in its bark and its leaf, and she laughed at how careful I was with the branches, like I was afraid of hurting them. In the killing heat of July, we thinned fruit side by side down the long rows until our hands were stained and aching, and she'd bring a jug of cold cider out to the shade, and we'd sit with our backs against a trunk, not saying much. And those silences were the closest thing to church I ever found. That was the spring the cat showed up, too. A half-starved orange Tom who walked out of the tree line and decided, for reasons known only to him, that I was his, and Josie named him Pippin after the apple and said, "See, even the cat can tell a good man when he's too dumb to leave." And I pretended not to hear the second half of that. Walt warmed to me slow, the way old proud men do, in gruffness and errands. And by the second year he'd taken to calling me the boy to the men at the feed store, which Ada Pruitt told me later was as close as Walt Ames came to adoption papers. Ada herself sized me up over the counter of her store my first month and clearly filed her verdict away for later, because that's the kind of woman she is, patient as a cat at a mouse hole. And through all of it, every single evening there was Josie and a plate. She cooked me through a whole year of the orchard, apple butter in the fall and braises in the deep of winter and the first tender things in spring, and once, on my birthday, which I had not told her, she made a cake because she'd wormed the date out of Walt, and she set it down in front of me with a single candle and said, "Nobody should have a birthday alone in a cottage," and I had to go out on the porch and stand in the cold a minute so she wouldn't see what that did to me. She was proposing to me every day of those 2 years. I understand now. I just wasn't fluent yet. I fell in love with her somewhere in the first winter, watching her laugh at her own burnt pie crust with flour on her nose in the lamplight of my little kitchen. But I held it careful and I held it silent, because loving her meant staying, and staying meant believing I was the kind of man a person keeps, and I had spent 33 years making very sure I never had to find that out. So I said nothing. I fixed the fences and learned the trees and ate the best food of my life across a small table from the best person I'd ever met, and I told myself it was enough. And it almost was. Right up until the evening, everything the three of us had built quietly on that hill came up against a man with a checkbook and a deadline. Walt's heart landed him in the hospital in August, 3 days that turned his hair whiter and put a fear in Josie's eyes I hadn't seen before. And when he came home smaller and quieter, and a few weeks later I came up to the farmhouse to talk to him about the harvest and found him at the kitchen table with a folder of papers and a face like a man reading his own obituary. The papers were an offer. A developer out of the city, a smooth operator named Rex Deering who'd been circling the valley buying up old farms, wanted the Ames orchard. All 40 acres. He wanted to bulldoze a century of apple trees and put up a subdivision, 40 houses with names like Orchard View and Ames Meadow Estates, the way they always name the thing after the very thing they killed to build it. And the number on the paper was more money than the orchard had made in all its years put together. And Walt, with his heart failing and his medical bills stacking and no way on God's earth to run 40 acres alone, and too proud to make his daughter spend her one life nursing a dying farm and a dying man both, had all but decided to sign it. "It's the sensible thing," Walt told me, not looking up. "I'm played out, son. The trees'll outlive me by a week the way I'm going. And then what? Josie chained to a hill that loses money. Alone, Deering's money would set her up. Let her go have her life. A man ought to know when he's beat." I didn't know what to say, so I said the true thing, which surprised us both. "The trees are the only thing I ever saw you love out loud, Walt," and the old man's jaw worked, and he said, "That's how I know it's time. When loving a thing starts costing the people you love more than the thing is worth, you let it go. You'll understand when you've got something to lose, if you ever stop running long enough to get it." That landed harder than he knew. Josie took the news like a blow she'd been bracing for. She didn't argue with her father, because she loved him and she could see how tired he was. But that night she didn't knock on my cottage door, and the dark little kitchen without her in it was the loneliest room I'd stood in for 2 years, and I understood. Standing there with a can of cold beans I couldn't bring myself to open, exactly how much I'd let myself have without ever admitting I had it. The deadline was 2 weeks out. Deering wanted an answer by the 1st of October, and he wanted the trees down before winter. Those 2 weeks were the strangest of my life, because on the surface nothing changed and underneath everything was ending. Josie came back the second night, because she couldn't not, and we ate in a silence with grief sitting at the table like a third chair. We picked the harvest anyway, her and me and a few neighbors, the last real harvest, and the Ames sweet came in sweeter than I'd ever tasted it, which felt like the orchard's cruelty, going out at its best. There was an evening in those 2 weeks I'll never shake. I came up to the farmhouse at dusk to return a ladder and found Walt out among the oldest trees alone, moving slow from trunk to trunk in the failing light, and I realized after a moment that he was saying goodbye to them, one at a time, his hand flat on each old bark like you'd lay a hand on the shoulder of an old friend in a hospital bed. He didn't know I was there, and I didn't let on. I just stood at the edge of the row and watched an old man take leave of the only thing he'd ever built that would outlast him, except now it wouldn't, and I understood for the first time in my life what it costs to love a thing enough to lose it, and how it is the exact opposite of the way I'd lived, keeping everything at arm's length so nothing could ever be taken. That night, Josie and I ate in silence, and she caught me looking at her and said, "What?" And I almost said it then, the whole of it. But the coward in me was older than the love in me by 30 years, and I let the moment pass, the way I'd let 100 of them pass. I have never regretted anything more than the moments in those 2 weeks I let pass. And on the 9th night, the 9th of those 14 ending days, Josie set a plate in front of me, a plate of everything I loved, the cider pork and the apple hand pies, a meal that must have taken her all day, and she sat down across from me and didn't pick up her fork, and her hands were shaking, and she looked at me with 2 years of unsaid things in her face, and she said the sentence that split my life into before and after. "Marry me," she said. "Before he sells it. Marry me, Sam." I put down my fork. I couldn't feel my hands. "Josie, just listen," she said. Fast now, the words tumbling like she'd rehearsed them and was afraid she'd lose her nerve. "The trust. My mother's trust. When she died, she left the orchard in a trust, and Dad can't sell it out from under it unless he's the last of the family working it. But if it passes to me, if it passes to a married daughter keeping it as a working farm, the developer's offer doesn't matter. Deering can't touch it. The bank will refinance for a married couple running it as a farm when they won't for one worn-out old man. I checked. I called them. It works. It actually works. But it only works if I'm married and keeping the orchard, and it only works before Dad signs, so marry me. We could save it. We could save all of it. And there it was. The most beautiful and the most devastating sentence anyone had ever said to me, and I heard only half of it, the half my whole broken life had trained me to hear. I heard save it. I heard the trust and the bank and the developer and the deadline. I heard a desperate woman reaching for the one card she had left to save her father's dying orchard. And that card was a drifter with a truck-and-a-half-packed duffel who happened to be standing close enough to marry. I did not hear the 2 years of dinners. I did not hear what a woman is actually saying when she cooks for a man every night for 2 years and then asks him, shaking, to stay forever. I heard a rescue, and I have never in my life wanted anything the way I wanted to say yes. And that wanting is exactly what made me say the stupidest, cruelest, most cowardly thing I have ever said. "You don't want to marry me, Josie," I said quietly. "You want to save the orchard, and I won't let you chain your one life to a drifter to do it. You deserve a marriage that's about you, not about the trees. I won't be the thing you settle for to keep a hill of apples." Her face. I will see her face for the rest of my life. It went from hope to hurt, to a terrible still blankness, and she stood up and she said, in a voice scraped hollow, "You think I'd marry a man I didn't," and she stopped, and she pressed her lips together, and she said instead, "Get out of my father's cottage, Sam, or pack that duffel you keep so ready. Either way, I'm done cooking for a man who can't tell the difference between being rescued and being loved." And she walked out into the dark, and she did not come back the next night or the night after, and the papers on Walt's table stayed where they were, waiting for the first of the month, and I did the thing I always do. I started packing. I got the duffel down off the shelf, the way I'd gotten it down 100 times in 100 rooms, and I started folding shirts into it out of pure animal habit, running before I could be left, and I was 3 shirts in when the barn cat came in through the window. There was a cat, I should say. An orange tom named Pippin, who'd adopted me my first spring, who slept on my chest and followed me down the tree rows and had, in his own way, been the first creature in a long time to decide I was worth staying near. He jumped up on the half-packed duffel and sat down square in the middle of it and looked at me. And I looked at him. And something about that stupid cat sitting in my getaway bag like a paperweight broke something loose in my chest. And I sat down on the floor of that little cottage next to my duffel and my cat, and I put my head in my hands, because I understood, all at once and far too late, that I had just done to Josie exactly what every place I ever ran from had done to me. I'd left first. I'd called it kindness, and it was just fear in a nicer coat. The days after were the worst I'd known in years, worse than any cold bunkhouse or empty highway, because those had been the loneliness I chose, and this was the loneliness I'd caused. The cottage kitchen sat dark at supper time. I'd catch myself at 6 o'clock, still listening for the knock, the soft scuff of her boots on the wet grass, and it wouldn't come. And the quiet would settle in like water, filling a boat. I saw her twice across the yard, and both times she turned and went the other way, and I don't blame her. The whole valley felt it. Men at the feed store who'd ribbed me for months about the boy who lucked into Walt Ames's cooking went quiet when I came in. Even Walt, who didn't know the particulars, looked at my face one morning and said only, "Whatever you did, son, undo it while there's time." I'm running short on time to watch things go wrong, and turned back to his coffee. Ada Pruitt runs the general store in town, and she'd been Walt's late wife's best friend for 50 years, and she is the sharpest, kindest, least patient woman in the valley. I went in for packing tape, God help me, actual packing tape. And Ada took one look at my face and set down the ledger she was working and said, "So, you turned her down." I hadn't told a soul. "How?" Sam Rourke, Ada said. The whole valley has watched that girl carry a hot supper across that yard to your cottage every single night for 2 years, in the rain, in the snow. The week her father was in the hospital, she still cooked for you. And you think I need to be told what happened to know it's gone wrong? What did you do? So I told her. The trust, the proposal, the thing I'd said about not being the thing she settled for. And Ada Pruitt looked at me the way you'd look at the dumbest animal on the farm, with a sort of exhausted love. And she said the thing that finally got through. You blessed fool. Let me tell you something about Josie Ames's mother, since I knew her 40 years. When Ruth wanted to tell a man she loved him, she didn't say it. She fed him. That was her whole language, that recipe box, that windowsill. She fed Walt Ames every night for 50 years, and that was the I love you, said fresh each day. And she taught it to her girl. Josie has been proposing to you every single night for 2 years, one plate at a time, and you were too busy guarding that duffel to hear a word of it. That girl did not offer to marry you to save the orchard. She used the orchard as an excuse to finally say out loud the thing she's been saying with her hands since the first week you got here. Because she was as scared as you are, and you looked her dead in the eye and told her love was a business arrangement. The trust is real. The bank thing is real. But it was never the reason, you great idiot. It was just the only way she could think of to be brave. And you told her to pack your bag. I was quiet a long time. Then I said, the papers get signed in 3 days. Then I expect, Ada said, turning back to her ledger, you've got 3 days to figure out whether you're a man with an address or a man with a duffel. Cider Day's tomorrow. Whole town will be up at the orchard for the last pressing. If I were a man who'd been loved that patient and thrown it back, I know where I'd be and what I'd be saying, and I wouldn't wait for the 3rd day to do it. Cider Day is the oldest thing our valley does. Every October, the Saturday of the harvest, the whole town comes up the gravel lane under the apple trees to pick the last of the fruit and run it through Walt's grandfather's old cider press, a great iron and oak machine that turns a whole year of the hill into gold in a bucket. And everybody drinks the first pressing cold and sweet right there in the grass, and it is the most beautiful thing I know, and this year it was also a funeral, because everyone knew it was the last one, that by spring there'd be 40 houses where the trees had stood. I got there as they were setting up the press under the big Ames suite at the center of the orchard, the oldest tree on the hill. The one Walt's grandfather had planted first, the one Walt's own mother had been married under a lifetime ago. Half the town was there. Walt sat in a chair in the shade looking at his trees like a man memorizing a face. And Josie was at the press, sleeves rolled, not looking at anybody, doing the work because the work was the only thing holding her together. And beside the whole gathering, at the edge of it, in a pressed shirt that cost too much, stood Rex Deering, come to oversee his purchase, papers no doubt in his car, waiting for Monday and the 1st of the month. I walked through the crowd to the press, and Pippin the cat trotted along behind me like he wanted to make sure I actually did it, and Josie looked up and saw me coming, and her whole body went still and guarded. And I stopped in front of her, close as that table where I'd broken both our hearts, and I said it loud enough for God and the whole valley and Rex Deering to hear. I've been packing, I said. Ask anybody. I got the duffel down and I started folding shirts, because that's what I do, Josie. That's the only thing I ever learned how to do. I leave before anybody can decide whether they want me to stay. I've done it my whole life, and 3 nights ago you asked me to stay forever, and I was so busy guarding that stupid bag that I called the truest thing anybody ever offered me a business arrangement. And I have come up here in front of everyone to tell you that I was wrong, and I was a coward, and Ada Pruitt is right that I'm a fool. Because you have been telling me you love me every single night for 2 years, one plate at a time, and I heard every word of it, and I was too scared to say I heard. So, I'm saying it now. I don't want to marry you to save the orchard. Save the orchard or don't, we'll fight for it either way. I'll cut fence and haul cider till my back gives out whether you'll have me or not. I want to marry you because I have had an address for 2 years and I was too much of a coward to admit it, and it's you, Josie. You're the address. You're the only place I ever stopped running. Marry me. Not to save anything, just because I'm finally done being a man who leaves first. The whole orchard had gone silent. Even the cider press had stopped. And Josie Ames stood there with cider on her hands and tears running clean down her face, and she said, in a shaking voice, "You said I was settling." "I know. You said you were the thing I'd settle for. I know. And it was the stupidest. Sam Rourke," she said, "I have loved you since the second week, when you ate my beef and barley like it was the first food you'd had in years, and I have been trying to feed you into staying ever since, and if you ever again mistake me loving you for me settling, I will put you in that cider press myself." And then she crossed the last of the distance between us and kissed me in front of the entire town under the oldest apple tree on the hill. And the valley came apart at the seams, everybody cheering, Ada Pruitt's voice sharp and triumphant over the top of it, old Walt Ames on his feet in the shade with both hands in the air, and Pippin the cat winding around our ankles taking full credit. And somewhere in the middle of it I felt the last 33 years of running just stop, the way a machine stops when you finally throw the right switch into a quiet that wasn't lonely at all. We were married under the Ames suite 6 weeks later, before the frost, with the whole valley there and Walt giving Josie away slow on his bad hip, prouder than I'd ever seen a man. Ada Pruitt stood up to say a few words and mostly just glared at me fondly and told the crowd. 2 years it took this one to hear what the girl was saying. Some men you have to feed a very long time, and the whole orchard laughed, and Josie laughed hardest of all. Pippin sat on a fence post through the whole ceremony like he was supervising. The trust held. Josie kept the orchard, and I quit being a tenant and became a husband and a partner and, God help me, a farmer. And the bank refinanced the married couple keeping the hill as a working farm just like she'd said. And Rex Deering drove his nice car out of our valley for the last time and named his subdivision after some other family's murdered orchard 2 towns over. We put the recipe box back on the windowsill where Ruth had kept it, and Josie added a card to it in her own hand, the beef and barley, the meal that started it, and under the recipe she wrote in pencil, "For Sam, the night I decided to keep him." My duffel is up in the barn loft now, empty, gathering dust, and I could not tell you where it is exactly, which is the whole point. A man who knows where the door is in every room he sleeps in has never once been home. I know that now. Walt lived to see 2 more harvests, and he spent them in his chair in the shade, watching his daughter, and the drifter she'd fed into staying bring in the Ames suite, and the morning he passed he was smiling, and the last thing he said to me was, "Told you you'd understand when you had something to lose." I understand, Walt, I understand every day. Josie still fixes me dinner most nights, though now I chop and haul and do the dishes and burn the occasional pie myself, and every single plate is still an "I love you" said fresh, and I have finally learned to hear it and to say it back, out loud, the way she was always brave enough to. I ask her sometimes, late, whether she ever thinks how close it came. If Ada hadn't set me straight, if that cat hadn't sat down in my bag, if I'd finished packing. And she says she thinks about it, but she doesn't believe it would have gone another way. Not really. "You'd have gotten to the county line," she told me once, and turned around. "I'd been feeding you for 2 years, Sam. You were already mine. You just hadn't admitted you were home. So here's what I've got for you. If you've read this far into the story of a man who almost ran off his own happiness, if there's a duffel bag in your life you keep half-packed, a love you keep mistaking for an arrangement because you can't believe you'd be chosen just for yourself, a table somebody keeps setting for you that you keep telling yourself you don't deserve to sit at, this is me telling you, From the far side of nearly losing all of it to my own fear, unpack the bag. Sit down at the table. Let yourself be kept. You have no idea how long someone's been telling you they love you in a language you were too scared to learn. I almost missed mine because I was too proud to hear a plate of food for what it was. Don't be as slow as I was. And if you'd stay a while longer with us, subscribe and let the next story keep you company. There's always a warm light on here at Lamplight, and the kettle's on, and there's a plate at the table with your name on it if you'll only sit down.